been 53 hours since we moved Auckland into COVID Alert Level 3 and the rest of New Zealand to Level 2. This afternoon, Cabinet met to receive the latest information and advice from the Ministry of Health and to discuss next steps in our resurgence response plan, a plan with the primary purpose of restoring our Level 1 freedoms as quickly as possible. We have made a good start on that plan. This is what we know about the new infection in New Zealand. We have identified 29 cases. At this stage, all remain linked to one cluster centred in Auckland. One other case that is likely linked to the cluster is still being investigated. We have undertaken more than 30,000 tests in the last 48 hours. 38 people linked to the cluster are now in government-managed quarantine as a precautionary measure. There are signs we have found this outbreak relatively early in its life. While the first case we identified tested positive this Tuesday, extensive testing and contact tracing has since determined that the earliest case we have found to date was a worker at the Americold Cool Store in Mount Wellington who became sick on approximately the 31st of July. This may not yet be the origin of the outbreak, but on the information we have to date, it's the earliest sign of the re-emergence of the virus. In terms of the ongoing investigation to identify where the virus originated from, there is still no clear connection at this point. Contact tracing and genomic testing has not found a link to the border or managed isolation and quarantine facilities at this stage. The sequence of the virus from the current outbreak is not the same as the sequences from community cases in our first original outbreak in New Zealand. This suggests this is not a case of the virus being dormant or of a burning ember in our community. It appears to be new to New Zealand. In terms of wider surveillance, since I made the announcement to move alert levels on Tuesday, we have tested more people than in any other time we have had COVID in New Zealand. We have stock for a further 303,000 tests currently in New Zealand. The Level 3 restrictions and the speed in which they were implemented will have made a material difference in containing the spread of this outbreak. So will everyone's compliance with those restrictions. Auckland travel data yesterday, the first full day of Level 3, shows a 60% reduction in travel compared with the last 3 Thursdays, which is even less travel than at Level 3 last time, which just demonstrates the incredible job that Aucklanders are currently doing. This is also what we know. We know the incubation period for COVID-19 and our experience of previous clusters, some of which reached more than 80 cases, means we can expect to see more cases as part of this cluster. It will grow before it slows, and it may continue to be linked to schools, churches and social gatherings as it has done to date. We also know, based on overseas experience and our own, that it is possible to contain a cluster or outbreak without ever being able to identify its origin. What is important is making sure that we establish the perimeter of the cluster and to stop it from growing. To do this, we do need to take into account that all-important incubation period. And so, in keeping with our precautionary approach and New Zealand's philosophy of going hard and going early, today Cabinet has agreed to maintain our current settings for an additional 12 days, bringing us to a full 2 weeks in total. Our current expectation is that by this time, the perimeter of the cluster will be identified, will be isolated, and we can move to level 2 in Auckland with confidence. That means Auckland will remain at level 3 and New Zealand will remain at level 2, the rest of the country, until 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday the 26th of August. We will, however, review these settings on the 21st of August. We want to give about a week's time to see how we are travelling before we review again. I would characterise our approach as short but precautionary hold and an ongoing investigation so that we continue to stamp out the virus. There is nothing to suggest we need to move to a level 4 lockdown at this stage, as we do not have a number of clusters or unrelated cases. I'll say that again because I've seen a lot of speculation. There is nothing to suggest we need to move to a level 4 lockdown. Cabinet also does not want Auckland to be in level 3 any longer than is needed to ensure the outbreak is managed. Our intention is that Auckland and New Zealand will quickly move back down through alert levels if we continue on this track. But it is wise to take a bit of extra time. That bit of extra time is our best way of getting out quickly. As always, the best economic response is a strong health response, and short and sharp is best. Lifting restrictions now and seeing a potential explosion in cases is the worst thing we could do for Auckland and the New Zealand economy. At the same time, level 3 does allow us to continue with more activity than a full level 4 lockdown, and I do think that's important to remember. Estimates are that the economy operates at roughly about 80% at level 3 compared to 60% at level 4. I am mindful, though, of the extraordinary disruption to business and the anxiety that this outbreak will be causing. As before, we will use what tools we have to protect jobs, incomes and businesses as well as people's health. To provide certainty to businesses and workers, I can confirm today that Cabinet has made an in-principle decision to extend the wage subsidy scheme to support businesses and protect jobs as we undertake the public health measures required to fight the virus. Happy to take questions. Jessica.
To all of North Island level 3, given that we've had cases now outside of Auckland?
No, that wasn't something that was viewed as necessary, nor was it something that the Director General advised Cabinet was necessary. Of those cases that we have in the Waikato area, they have all been connected, they've all been contact traced, they've been tested and they're in isolation. And that is part of our normal regime. We have to, of course, remember level 2 is designed to be able to coexist alongside a strong contact tracing, isolation and quarantine system. The issue is we have a larger outbreak in the city of Auckland, which is why we have high level of restrictions there.
Was there debate about whether it should go down to level 2, given that it has been those 12 new cases today? I guess some people were expecting that to be bigger.
Ultimately though, what we have seen is of those cases, we are contact tracing a large number of people. And they are groups of people who prior to the identification of these first cases, so before we were aware of them, had attended churches, had attended schools. And so we're very mindful of the need that whilst we have a small number of currently identified cases, that we need to identify the full perimeter of this cluster and reduce down its potential impact as much as possible. We were very keen to allow ourselves the time to review. If we find, for instance, over the next 7 days, that the perimeter is identified, that it's well contained, we give ourselves the space to consider our settings, but ultimately, for the sake of certainty, we foresee it being no longer at this stage than an additional 12 days. Would you allow me to perhaps give Dr. Bloomfield a chance to speak to his advice on that as well?
Thank you, Prime Minister, and kia ora koutou. So just to reiterate the points the Prime Minister's made, our public health advice is essentially consistent with what the decision Cabinet made, which was to extend the current settings for 12 days. The total of 14 days in Alert Level 3 in Auckland and Alert Level 2 around the country is the incubation period, but more important here is we feel that will give us sufficient time to have absolutely determined the extent of the current outbreak and to have contact traced, isolated and tested to identify that and confirm that, both within Auckland and any cases that further cases there may be outside of Auckland. So different from the situation earlier, there may well still be the odd case and the odd new case in 12 days' time. However, the plan now is, and the reason we have put all the effort in to strengthening our testing and contact tracing and to adding in this addition of quarantining our cases to, in particular, prevent onward transmission within households. The reason we've boosted all that is that we can contact trace and test and isolate our way through this outbreak. The alert levels provide additional assurance here. And I just want to make one final comment again on that quarantine situation. One of the bits of feedback we had is in some of the earlier clusters, we had some families, part of that Maris cluster, who ended up spending 46 days in their home environment, isolated, because they kept getting transmission within the family. So one of the key reasons we want to create that opportunity for a very managed quarantine situation for these families affected is so that that doesn't have to happen again.
Yes. Thank you. How likely is it that we will never identify the source of this outbreak? And can we extrapolate from your comments that, given it is a new strain and wasn't lying dormant, but it is linked to our borders?
No, because you will have actually heard me say that of the genome testing that's been done to date, nothing actually does draw that link at this stage between the case that we have and those who are genome tested within our quarantine. So at the moment, there isn't that link there. It doesn't rule it out completely, but that is what that testing has demonstrated to date. Yeah, and so this is, we've had a number of theories that we've continued to try and chase down and that we will continue to pursue. You'll know that one that has been canvassed more broadly has been the idea of whether or not it was just a burning ember that existed in the community that now essentially has really been diminished as a potential because the strain that we have at the moment is not something that we saw originally in New Zealand. Of course, the cases at the moment are still congregating around one work site that was a cool store. There's a number of theories that exist, but not a lot of research that tells us at this point whether or not surfaces are in play or whether or not there was a connection through that supply chain as yet. We continue to pursue that, but we may not know. And so what I would prepare everyone for, we do not necessarily need to answer that question in order to contain and deal with this cluster effectively. In fact, overseas, that has been the case on many occasions, and in fact in New Zealand we've had those circumstances too. I'll let you finish your question, Toba.
Just that update from the 1 PM press conference when we weren't certain of the link with that one case is in Auckland Hospital. You're now saying that it's likely linked to the cluster. Can you elaborate on that and how and what you know?
Yes, what I can add is that there is a connection between where that person's workplace is and the Americold workplace, and it seems very likely that we will be able to connect that case back to this existing cluster, but it's still not yet confirmed.
What does today's decision mean for the timing of the election?
Today, the most important focus for Cabinet and indeed for myself on the advice of the Director General was what we do with alert levels. And so that's not a decision that I have taken at this stage, but obviously we have another 48 hours, and so I'll take that time and make sure that you hear from me further on that in the interim.
12 hours means that the election on September 19th can no longer happen given the campaign.
Sorry, what was your rationale? Sorry? Right. Look, again, the focus here has been making this decision. I will make sure that we have extra detail on the question of the election, but the focus in the immediate point here has been making sure that we make a decision over what's happening for Auckland and the rest of New Zealand. One point I would make is that keep in mind, and I just add this for the benefit of the Electoral Commission, not to predetermine anything with this statement, but the Electoral Commission has done planning around offering an election within a level 2 scenario. I only say that to just remind people that they are taking precautions as well. I want people to be assured that they are thinking about the circumstances for New Zealand, whatever they may be in the future. Sam.
Resolution of Parliament then, so that is
Monday?
something you will make a decision on before
Prior,
Monday morning.
of course, yes, yes.
So what
Yep,
happens to the rest of the country when Auckland moves to level 2? Does the rest of the country stay at level 2?
We'll make an assessment at that time. So every time we reassess Auckland settings, we'll make an assessment around the rest of New Zealand as well. Derek.
Are you firm on that August 26th date, or have you given yourself some wiggle room with the review on August 21? If the mass testing showed, that the outbreak appeared to be contained, might we move alert settings? Ease them early.
Yeah, it's a review, and so we are giving ourselves that opportunity. We did want, however, to give people a bit of certainty around the planning. We foresee, at this stage, no reason why it will be any longer than midnight Wednesday the 26th of August, but we will be reviewing in 7 days' time.
Did you discuss making masks mandatory?
No, we've had good discussion around that. Everyone was continuing to be of the view that we need to continue to encourage their use, make sure there's provision for their use, and we'll keep that under advisement. But at this stage, people were satisfied with that decision.
Did you decide not to move Aotearoa into a higher alert level, given the 2 cases there?
Yeah, at this stage, of course, those cases are very clearly and directly linked to the travel and socialising of one identified case. They're being identified through contact tracing. They were proactively tested through that process and then isolated and quarantined. So that has actually been all in keeping with our plan as cases emerge or if we have an outbreak. The reason we've treated that differently to Auckland, of course, Auckland is the source. It's where we're predominantly seeing the infection. It is where we're primarily still determining the perimeter of the cluster. But Director General.
Can I make an additional comment on that? One of the things that's really encouraging in this outbreak is not just the testing that is happening, but how early on in their symptoms people are coming forward to be tested. So the cases in Tokoroa came forward to be tested on Tuesday, symptomatic, even though their exposure had just been on the weekend. And so this is a really critical measure for our success in being able to rapidly identify cases, isolate them, and then contact trace. And as I said at 1 o'clock, we already know that of the many hundreds of people we have followed up as contacts, we've had over 83% of them contacted and isolated within that 48-hour period, which is great.
Yeah.
Sorry, don't we have to identify the source of this in order to have confidence that we won't see a repeat?
No, not necessarily. What also gives us confidence is the wide range of testing, and you will see here the fact that we've had 30,000 tests and are still identifying cases that are all traceable and connected to this cluster. So that's one thing that gives us confidence. Time gives us that additional confidence, because if there were additional cases, we would start to see those arise as well. And thirdly, our own experience. We have had clusters before where we haven't always been able to identify the source, and indeed overseas you see in the likes of, from memory, Dr. Bloomfield, Germany, I believe, has had clusters they've managed and contained where they haven't always been able to identify the source. It is still preferable, and we will continue all of the investigatory work to try and determine that, but it may be the case that we don't, and that wouldn't be a reason not to lower our alert level. Yeah.
What are the latest modelling numbers you have?
Well, actually, the most recent conversation I've had with those who have been talking to our modellers is that clusters aren't actually an easy thing or something you can successfully model, because everything is unique to that cluster. It's when you have wider outbreaks and multiple clusters that the modelling's more accurate. So the caution I've been given is that modelling is unlikely to be able to predict what we would see here. We can rely, however, on past clusters just to get a sense of how they tend to behave and the scale of them. And we have seen in New Zealand clusters that can get up to the 80, 100 mark. Is that a fair reflection, Dr. Bloomfield?
What about the election question?
Yes.
One of the options, obviously, you have available to you is just to leave it to the Electoral Commission. If they have the powers to defer, would that be a prudent course of action, given that would take the politics out of it?
Yeah, look, again, as I say, the most important, and I think it's not an unfair statement, the most important thing for Cabinet, and indeed myself today, because that is where the decision over the election date at the moment falls. You're right to say that down the track it would fall to the Electoral Commission. At the moment, my focus was simply on making sure that our resurgence plan was in place, that we're doing everything that we need and we have the settings in the right place. I've got another 48 hours, I'm going to use it, and I'll come back on the question of the election.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Who you bring into your confidence? Who you consult with over the election day?
Oh, well, ultimately it's something that falls on my shoulders. I am aware, though, of the Electoral Commission's view and all of the issues they have to factor in. It's one of the reasons I did highlight that they have done preparatory work around the different settings New Zealand might be in. But I did make sure that I was briefed by them in that regard yesterday afternoon, so that I can factor all of that in my thinking. Brett?
Just in terms of the difficulty with the modelling, but
Yes.
do you then have milestones, though, that you can look at in terms of working out whether this particular cluster is coming under control, where you feel comfortable about dropping down the levels?
Yes. I'll let Dr. Bloomfield, because he has to use that information to give advice to us.
Yeah, so I think the critical thing is the pattern of the spread that we see over the next, and the cases we see over the next 7 to 12 days, and the sort of settings they're occurring in. So partly it's about the number, and also whether there is geographical containment, and or whether those cases and or their close contacts have been in settings where there could have been further spread, like churches or schools and so on. We've seen that already. So again, it's looking at the pattern, geographical and those sorts of settings, the number of cases, the links between them, and also we'll also be looking for the rate of growth. We're growing quite quickly at the moment. We'll want to see that level off.
Yeah. One of the things we have discussed, though, is that don't expect that we have to see, for instance, 0 cases at all in order to move levels. It is something that we've discussed. Of course, our regime has to be built for us to be able to exist in a level 2 environment with the management of cases. What we will be looking for, though, is just to really have a sense that we've got what I'm calling the perimeter of the cluster under control. I'll come to Jackson.
Prime Minister, it's obviously still early days, but all of the cases except the one still under investigation can be linked to the same cluster. Have we dodged a bullet here?
It is heartening to see at this stage that linkage between all of those cases. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We've always taken a precautionary approach, because if you make a wrong move with COVID, we can see very easily the long-term impact of that, and particularly in terms of how long, as a consequence of the wrong move, you can spend with restrictions. And Australia, has demonstrated that to us. So we are looking at the experience of others and making our decisions.
The situation in Melbourne playing in influencing your decision to go hard very early?
We're evidence-based, and so you would expect us to look overseas at what other experiences have demonstrated, the likes of Hong Kong or the likes of Australia, where they have taken a little bit more time and existed with a more open environment while they've determined a perimeter of an outbreak. Our view is it's better to assess that with restrictions in place, so ultimately you can get back to freedom faster. That's our approach.
30,000 tests. Sorry.
Sure.
Thank you. Of the 30,000 tests, what portion were done in Auckland?
Forgive me, I don't have a breakdown with me here. I do know that we have that, though, by DHB. We can provide that. I wouldn't be surprised if it's provided publicly.
Yeah, my understanding, it's about half of them. So at least 50%.
Yeah.
After the 1 PM update, were you provided details of further testing results, or are you still relying?
We're sticking to the 1 PM. I would say that there's, again, the pattern that we're describing here has not changed. So the pattern of the cluster has not changed. Yeah.
On the move to a level 4, what are the criteria or the thresholds we should watch for if we need to go?
A good question. Nothing obviously that we're seeing here, but you'll remember that the criteria for level 4 is multiple outbreaks, multiple scenes of community transmission, just a much larger scale than what we're dealing with here. Yeah.
Just on the extension, does this set a precedent? So, just on the extension, just on the extension of the wage subsidy scheme, have you got any indication about how much extra that's going to cost?
I don't want to steal the thunder of the Minister of Finance, who will take the podium immediately after we've completed questions. But remember, we do have an underspend currently for the second extension. We had an estimate that it would be roughly 2.6 to 3.9 billion in terms of the drawdown on that. It's actually come in closer to 2. So there is already an appropriation that we can draw on for a wage subsidy extension. Yep.
With a third of the population now and much more severe restrictions for a much longer time, could New Zealand still consider itself a team of 5 million?
Yes. Not everyone in a team is on the field at the same time. And, some of us currently are on the sidelines really rooting for those who are experiencing those that level of restriction. And that's why I just asked the rest of the team to be...
Kia ora, good evening. Auckland's lockdown has been extended. Our biggest city will remain in level 3 for an additional 12 days and the rest of the country in level 2 for the same period. So that takes us to 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday the 26th of August. Well, that's after 13 new cases were announced today. 12 of those are linked to the Auckland cluster. Officials have yet to establish an official link to one other case, and that person is currently in Auckland Hospital. Well, there are 29 cases in the cluster, and the Prime Minister is warning it will continue to grow, so we will see numbers continue to rise. The cluster has now spread outside of Auckland to Aotearoa, where 2 people are confirmed cases and 1